My grandfather was a survivor of World War II. I now know the horrifying truth behind it. Whenever I would ask my grandfather to tell me stories about World War II, he would start panicking and quickly try to change the topic. He'd scream at me and tell me to never ask him about it again. It was like he was scared of something that he didn't want me to know about. But I would soon find out that the real reason was much more horrifying. Things were different today, though, and his response was different. He made me promise to never tell anyone about what we talked about today. And after agreeing, he began telling the story. This all happened back in 1942, sometime during the middle of the war. I was stationed at an internment camp a few hours outside of Nevada. It was completely isolated from the rest of the world and very few people knew about it. It was here that all of the most notorious war prisoners were held, the ones that were too dangerous to keep anywhere else. Our job was simple. All we had to do was make sure no one escaped. Everything was fine at first. However, things quickly changed, and the most horrific day of my life began on November 3rd, 1942. The day started like any other. I was awoken at 3 a.m. to begin my shift on one of the guard towers. I quickly got out of bed and made my way to the camp's cafeteria before it was time to go. I took a seat and pulled out my journal and began writing. I did this every morning, and I used this as a way to take my mind off of what was happening in the world. I was only 19 and it felt like I didn't belong there. I wasn't strong like everyone else. I couldn't handle the sight of war and death. I missed home, and so every morning I would write a letter to my family, in case I didn't make it back alive. I spent the next half hour writing until it was time to take my position on the guard tower. It was about 2 hours into my shift when it happened. The sun was just starting to rise when suddenly the alarm started blaring. Someone was trying to escape. I quickly stood up from my chair and switched the large spotlight on in front of me and began aiming it around the ground outside, hoping I could find him. A few minutes had gone by and I was ready to give up when I saw him. There was a man crawling, weaving his way in and around rocks and bushes to avoid being seen. I knew what I had to do. I put my rifle around my neck and aimed in with the scope. I waited until my crosshair was directly on his head. I looked at the young man for a moment. I could tell he was Japanese, and then I fired. He was dead. I was getting ready to sit back down in my chair when I was interrupted by something. The sound of large engines. The sun was up by this point, and as I turned my head around, I was greeted by the sight of dozens of planes. It was the Japanese military. They had found us. Quickly, the alarms began to ring once more, but it was too late. As they flew over the outpost, their hatches opened, and bombs quickly fell to the floor. Following them was what looked like some type of yellow gas. I had never seen something like that before. Before I had any time to react, the bombs touched the ground, and a large explosion took place. I was immediately knocked out. After what felt like hours, I awoke, covered in blood and ash. I quickly stood up and was horrified to see that almost the entire camp had been destroyed. The only things remaining were the guard towers and the area where the prisoners were kept. I ran down the stairs of the guard tower and made my way into the camp, and immediately I knew something was deeply wrong. I saw the bodies of dozens of prisoners and soldiers. Each had their bodies and stomachs ripped open, and there was flesh and blood everywhere. Completely horrified, I tried to look away, but I was interrupted by a strange noise. It was like the sound of flesh being torn through. I walked through the smoke a bit more, and that was when I saw it. There was a prisoner hunched over a body, and he was eating him. I knew this wasn't right, and as I tried to go back, I stepped on a bottle and broke it. Immediately, the infected prisoner snapped his head up at me and began charging towards me. I tried firing my gun at him, but for some reason it didn't stop him. He just kept running. I quickly holstered my gun and began running. As I made my way deeper into the ruins of the outpost, more and more of the infected began chasing me. I knew there was a bunker hidden on the other side of this place, and I had to get to it. I was holding out in the middle of the courtyard when one nearly got me. I had forgotten to check behind me, and one of the infected quickly threw me to the floor. This was it, I thought. I was going to die here. However, suddenly, right before he could begin eating me, a bullet went through his head, and a man appeared out of nowhere and pulled me up. "We need to go now," he shouted. We quickly started running again, taking out as many of the infected as we could. "You need to shoot them in the head, otherwise they don't die," the man said. "Are you going to tell me your name? You just saved my life," I said. "My name's Ivan, but you don't need to thank me. Just keep running," he said. "We need to make it to the bunker," I screamed. "No, what we need to do is lure all of them into there, and then we'll get out and lock them in. We can't let these things out into the world," Ivan said. I didn't like the idea, but Ivan seemed like he was smart, so I agreed to the plan. He stayed ahead up and made sure to peek around every corner before me and would take out each of the infected. Finally, after what felt like hours, we made our way to the entrance of the bunker. It was guarded by a heavy steel door and dozens of layers of protection. "Okay, you're going to try to get that door open and I'll cover you," Ivan told me as he began firing into the crowds of the infected charging towards us. I quickly got to work, attempting to pull on the door, but it was locked. I knew that all of the generals had a key to unlock the door, so I began searching through all of the mutilated bodies spread out throughout the room. Eventually, I got lucky and found one. I ripped the key from around his waist and inserted it into the door. It clicked, and I slowly pulled the bunker door open. "It's open! Let's go!" I shouted to Ivan as I motioned for him to follow me. As we made our way deeper into the bunker, we noticed that there was no power down here. We quickly switched the flashlights on our rifles on and waited for the infected to follow us down. "We only have one shot at this, so we're going to need to make it count. I want to make it back to my family. She's pregnant. I'm going to be a dad," Ivan said. "We're going to train them around the bunker, and once we're sure that they're all in here, we're going to clear a path and get out of here." I quickly nodded my head and we waited. It wasn't long before the shrieks of the infected got louder, and they began chasing us further into the bunker. We began firing our guns, taking out as many as we could. and the ones we couldn't kill we would make sure didn't reach us. After what felt like hours, we knew that all of the infected had to be in here. "Okay, that should be all of them. Let's get out of here," Ivan shouted. We began running back towards the entrance, working to clear a path between all of the infected. We were just about to reach the entrance when suddenly one of the infected on the stairs grabbed my arm and began pulling me back. I tried fighting back, but they were too strong. I closed my eyes, accepting that this was where I was going to die, when once again Ivan stepped in. He took out the infected that was grabbing my arm and pulled me back up onto my feet. Except, this time things were different. In the middle of pulling me back up, the infected grabbed Ivan and pulled him into the crowd. I quickly pulled out my gun and began firing to try to save him, but there were too many. "Just go!" Ivan screamed as his flesh was slowly ripped out of his body. I turned around and began running up the stairs. I was too afraid to look behind me. All I could hear were the horrifying screams of Ivan as he was torn to pieces. I eventually made my way out of the bunker and slammed the door shut and locked it. I sat for a moment, unable to comprehend what had just happened. Ivan had saved my life, but lost his own in the process. He'll never get to see his family again. His unborn child, his wife. Shortly after escaping, I was rescued by several military helicopters who had been alerted about the incident. As we were flying away, I looked out the window of the helicopter to see what remained of the outpost being bombed, so that what happened there would never happen again. In that moment, I thought about Ivan and the sacrifice he made. Not only did he save my life, but he saved the entire world, and I will remember him forever.